The grand ballroom of the New York Charity Gala was alive with an air of anticipation, its opulent chandeliers casting a soft glow over the room. The event, meant to be a night of elegance and goodwill, had drawn high society figures, philanthropists, and media elites, all mingling under the glittering lights, sipping champagne, and discussing the latest headlines. At the center of it all was Melania Trump, the guest of honor, radiant in a midnight blue gown. Despite the political noise surrounding her husband, she had remained graceful, focusing on her charitable work and staying above the fray. Tonight was no exception. As she stepped onto the stage to deliver her speech about children's education and humanitarian aid, the room fell silent. Her words, delivered with quiet confidence and a touch of her Slovenian accent, carried an air of elegance and poise. But just as she was finishing, a sharp, mocking voice cut through the room like a knife. "Mrs. Trump, how does it feel to be complicit in your husband's agenda?" The question came from David Calloway, a tall, sharply dressed journalist, known for his openly liberal stance and his penchant for attacking conservatives under the guise of journalistic integrity. He stood near the front of the audience, microphone raised like a weapon, his tone dripping with disdain. A hush fell over the room. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging knowing glances. This wasn't going to be a normal Q&A. Melania's lips parted slightly, but before she could respond, Calloway pressed forward. "Your husband has been accused of dividing the country, of fostering hate." He continued, his voice growing bolder as all eyes turned to him. "And yet, you stand here acting like a role model. Don't you think the real role models are the people fighting against him?" The words hung heavy in the air, the tension suffocating. A few reporters smirked, already sensing a viral moment in the making. But before Melania could respond, a different voice shattered the silence, firm, unwavering. "That's enough." All heads turned as Barron Trump stepped forward from the audience, no longer the quiet boy the world once saw. In the White House, the now 17-year-old stood tall, his broad shoulders squared and his jaw clenched. He moved past the tables with a confidence that commanded attention, stepping onto the stage without hesitation to stand directly between his mother and the reporter. His presence alone shifted the energy in the room. "Excuse me," Calloway said, raising an eyebrow. Surprised but unfazed, Barron didn't blink. "You can ask tough questions," he said, his voice calm but unshakable. "But what you're doing isn't journalism, it's bullying." The room erupted into whispers. Calloway, caught off guard, let out a breathy chuckle, trying to play it off. "Oh, and I suppose you, Trump's son, are going to lecture me on media ethics." Barron tilted his head slightly, his sharp eyes locked on Calloway's. "No," he said smoothly. "I'm going to show you what respect looks like." The tension in the ballroom had transformed from an undercurrent to a tidal wave. All eyes were on Barron. No one had expected him to step in. Not like this. Not with such controlled confidence. Calloway, the journalist who had sparked the confrontation, was still trying to process the moment. He had expected a flustered Melania, maybe even a moment of hesitation he could spin into a viral clip. What he hadn't anticipated was Barron Trump standing his ground. Calloway's smirk wavered for just a second before he composed himself. "Respect?" he repeated mockingly. "Forgive me, Barron, but I don't think you or your family get to lecture the press on respect." A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the audience, but Barron didn't flinch. "You can ask whatever questions you want," he said, his voice steady. "But what you just did, you didn't ask a question. You tried to humiliate my mother." Calloway's smirk faded slightly, but he held his ground. "Mrs. Trump is a public figure," he countered. "She should expect tough questions." Barron took a slow step closer, his height forcing Calloway to look up at him. "Then why didn't you ask her about her work tonight? About the children?" "She's helping." The crowd stirred. It was a simple question, but it struck deep. Calloway had no real response, and he knew it. His job was never to highlight Melania's accomplishments. It was to reduce her to a political pawn. Before Calloway could recover, Barron continued. You came here with one goal, to make headlines. You didn't care about what this event is actually about. You wanted a viral clip, something to throw on Twitter to get a few thousand likes from, people who already agree with you. The room fell completely silent. A few guests near the back exchanged looks, realizing that Barron wasn't just reacting. He was in control of this moment. Calloway's confidence faltered. He glanced at the other journalists in the room, as if hoping for backup. But none of them spoke. They weren't used to being called out like this, not by a Trump, and certainly not by a 17-year-old. Melania, who had been standing quietly behind her son, placed a gentle hand on his arm. She didn't say a word, but her expression spoke volumes. Pride, strength, and a silent message of solidarity. Calloway, realizing he was losing ground fast, tried to regain control. He forced a smirk and folded his arms. You're young, Barron, he said, shaking his head. You don't understand how this works. Barron didn't blink. I understand exactly how this works, he said smoothly. I've been watching people like you attack my family since I was a kid. The journalist's smirk faded completely. Barron took another step forward, his voice steady. I just didn't think you'd be pathetic enough to attack a woman who's done nothing but try to help others. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Someone near the back gasped. Even some of the journalists who had expected another routine hit job on a Trump were stunned into silence. Calloway's face reddened slightly, but before he could retaliate, another voice from the crowd broke the moment. Barron's right. A man in a tailored suit stood near one of the round tables. He was older, with salt and pepper hair and the presence of someone used to commanding a room. A respected businessman, perhaps even a donor. He looked straight at Calloway. This is a charity event, he said. This isn't the place for petty political stunts. More murmurs rippled through the audience. A few others nodded in agreement. For the first time that night, David Calloway looked uncertain. His moment was slipping away. But Barron wasn't finished yet. The silence in the ballroom was heavy, thick with tension and expectation. All eyes were on him. No one was used to seeing a Trump take on the press quite like this. Not with anger or deflection, but with cold, measured precision. He wasn't lashing out. He was dismantling Calloway piece by piece. Calloway, the once confident journalist, clenched his jaw. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. He had come prepared to provoke Melania Trump into an awkward moment, a headline-grabbing misstep. Instead, he had walked straight into a storm he hadn't seen coming. Calloway forced a chuckle, shaking his head as if Barron was just some naive teenager. You know, Barron, he said, it's easy to stand up for your family when you've grown up in a golden tower. But out here in the real world, people like me have to ask the tough questions. That's what journalism is. A few in the audience nodded instinctively, but something was off. The usual rhythm of media attacks wasn't working tonight. Calloway's words sounded defensive, desperate even. Barron tilted his head slightly, a hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had him. You mean the real world where my mother is here supporting charities while you're trying to get a headline off of humiliating her? Calloway's smirk vanished. Barron stepped closer, his voice commanding attention. You want to talk about the real world? Fine. He gestured to the crowd. How many people here tonight came to hear about helping children? About education and giving back? A few guests raised their hands. Others nodded. Even those who weren't Trump supporters weren't here for a political fight. They had come for the cause. Barron turned back to Calloway. And how many people here came to listen to you make this about yourself? The crowd shifted again. A few chuckles rippled through the room. The dynamic had flipped completely. Calloway was no longer the one controlling the moment. He opened his mouth to respond, but Barron cut him off. No, really, Barron said. pretending to wait for an answer. Because as far as I can tell, the only person in this room who thought this was about politics was you. A few people clapped. It wasn't just polite applause. It was approval. Barron folded his arms, his eyes locked on Calloway like a predator sizing up his prey. You came here hoping to embarrass my mother. Instead, you embarrassed yourself. The crowd erupted. Even those who didn't necessarily support Trump recognized the power shift. Barron had done something they had never seen before. He had beaten the media at their own game. Calloway's face was red now. He tried to speak, but the moment had already slipped through his fingers. His confidence, his arrogance, it was all gone. And then, just to drive the final nail in, Barron leaned in slightly and delivered the finishing blow. Next time, he said smoothly, if you want to attack a Trump, maybe try picking on someone your own size. The ballroom exploded into applause. Calloway stiffened. He had no comeback. He had played his game, and tonight, he had lost. As Barron turned back toward his mother, standing tall and composed, one thing was clear to everyone in that room. The youngest Trump had just made his mark. The applause hadn't even died down before Calloway realized just how bad things had turned against him. His once confident smirk was gone, replaced with a stiff, forced expression. Barron stood tall, his shoulders squared, his gaze locked onto Calloway like a lion watching a wounded animal. He had seized control of the moment, and the crowd knew it. Calloway wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the hunted. But the journalist wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. He adjusted his tie, forcing a chuckle. So that's it then? He said, trying to sound amused, though his voice had lost its edge. You're telling me I can't ask questions because it might upset your family. Barron's expression didn't change. His voice remained smooth, controlled. You didn't ask a question. You made an accusation. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Even those who weren't Trump supporters couldn't deny that Barron was right. Calloway's jaw tightened. His eyes darted toward a few other journalists in the room, as if silently pleading for backup. But none of them spoke. They knew what had just happened. Calloway had lost control of the room. Barron stepped forward again. Not aggressive, just deliberate. His presence alone was enough to make Calloway take a half step back. You tried to frame my mother as a villain, Barron continued. But you failed, because the truth is, she's here helping, making a difference. He gestured to the charity banners hanging behind the stage, displaying the faces of the children and families Melania's foundation had supported. And what are you doing? Barron tilted his head slightly. What are you actually contributing tonight besides negativity? Calloway's face was turning a deeper shade of red. His confidence was gone. His body language betrayed him. His shoulders had tensed. His grip on the microphone had tightened. And for the first time, he looked uncomfortable. The audience wasn't on his side anymore. In fact, some of them were shaking their heads. Calloway swallowed hard. I was just doing my job, he muttered. Barron smirked slightly. Then maybe, he said, you should try doing it better. The crowd erupted again. This time, it wasn't just polite applause. It was thunderous. Even people who had come in skeptical of the Trumps couldn't deny what had just happened. Calloway had walked in expecting to dominate the room, to turn the night into a spectacle. Instead, he had become the spectacle. And Barron Trump? He had just completely dismantled him in front of the entire elite media establishment. Melania, who had been watching quietly, smiled softly. She didn't need to say anything. Her son had already said everything that needed to be said. Calloway, realizing there was no way to save himself from this disaster, lowered his microphone and turned away. The walk of shame had begun. And Barron Trump? He simply turned back toward his mother, standing by her side. Because tonight, He wasn't just defending her. He was proving that the next generation of Trumps wasn't going anywhere. David Calloway gripped his microphone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had lost. Completely. And the worst part, it wasn't because he had been shouted down. It wasn't because someone silenced him. It was because a 17-year-old had outclassed him in front of the entire room. The crowd was still buzzing. Some people clapping, others whispering, some just staring at Calloway as if watching a man self-destruct in real time. Even some of the journalists, his own colleagues, avoided his gaze, too embarrassed to be associated with what had just happened. But Calloway wasn't done yet. He could feel his career flashing before his eyes. This was supposed to be an easy win, a headline-worthy ambush that would go viral in minutes. Instead, he was standing there like a fool, humiliated by the very people he had planned to impress. He needed to salvage this. Fast. Forcing a smirk, he lifted the microphone one last time. "Well," he said, "if you can't handle a little pushback, maybe politics isn't for you." It was weak. A desperate attempt to throw one final punch. But Barron didn't even blink. He didn't flinch, didn't step back. He just smiled, a knowing, amused smile that sent a clear message. "That's all you've got?" And that's when Calloway realized he was finished. He had thrown everything he had, and yet Barron was standing there, untouched, composed, unshaken. The applause that followed wasn't just for Barron anymore. It was for the fact that Calloway had just buried himself. A few murmurs started rippling through the audience. Someone chuckled. A wealthy donor near the front turned to his wife and whispered something that made her smile. Calloway saw it. He saw all of it, and in that moment, he knew he wasn't just walking away from this conversation. He was walking away a failure. His face tightened. He muttered something under his breath, barely audible over the noise, before finally turning around and walking off. The walk of shame. The cameras followed every step. He had entered this ballroom expecting to break headlines. Instead, he had become one, and the world was going to see it. Meanwhile, Barron turned to his mother. Melania looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with the grace and composure that had defined her for years, she simply reached out, gently straightening his suit jacket. It was a small gesture, one that spoke volumes. Barron smirked slightly, giving her a small nod before turning back to the room. The crowd, sensing the moment, rose to their feet. The standing ovation was deafening for Melania, for Barron, but also for the fact that tonight, something had changed. For years, people had underestimated him, had seen him as nothing more than the youngest Trump, a boy in the background. But after tonight, no one would ever make that mistake again. What a moment. Barron Trump didn't just defend his mother. He proved that he's a force to be reckoned with. The way he stood his ground, the way he turned the tables. This was more than just a debate. It was a statement. What do you think? Did Barron handle the situation the right way? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next powerful story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.